a review of integumentary system models. So we'll look at the layers, the types of tissues, and then some of the structures that we see in here and compare them in two different models. First, the layers. The overall layer from here to here, this is all the epidermis. In our previous video, I expanded that and looked at the 4 to 5 layers of the epidermis, depending on where you're at. Epidermis. Then the rest of this layer, all the way down so we get to this adipose tissue, is all the dermis. And then where we see this adipose tissue below the dermis is the hypodermis. On this model, we took out the epidermis. So there is no epidermis on this model. It's showing you dermis until we get to the hypodermis. The reason why we took it out is showing these wavy ridges here. And so we'd have connections with the epidermis. It'll be epidermal ridges that connect with these dermal papillae. And these describing the hills and valleys is actually what contributes to our fingerprints or footprints. And it's like an interlocking mechanism of the fingers coming together of the dermis and the epidermis. When we look at the dermis, and I go inside, the first layer here, it's about 20% of all the dermis, and I teach it as just finger length running through the model. This is the papillary layer. So if I continue on this side, just this width here, the layer is papillary layer. Then the rest of all of this, discarding the structures, we'll learn the structures in the layer, but this entire section here, it's like the rest of my hand in width when you compare it on the model. This is all the reticular layer. So the dermis is 2 layers, papillary layer, and then the rest is reticular. Over here, papillary, and then reticular layer until I get to that adipose tissue. The adipose tissue is what makes up the hypodermis. Now we look at some of the structures inside. First, let's look at these structures here. They have these little heads and tails, a head and then a tail drop down. On this side, you can see a head and then a head and a tail. These are called tactile corpuscles or Meissner corpuscles, and they're for light touch. So I can feel like the wind or a spider running along me, or just like light little touch helps me to feel things like I'm grasping. Those are called tactile corpuscles. Versus the bigger structure here, this brown one here, and then these 2 yellow ones that kind of look like onions. These are called Pacinian corpuscles, also called lamellated corpuscles. These are for deeper touch. So remember we said one of our functions of the skin is to be able to have specialized sensations. And these sensations include these corpuscles, these collections that have a nervous function, so I can feel light touch and deep touch. When we look at the hairs inside, and I run up to the top, we can divide it into 2 sections. The root is when I have the hair inside the skin. As it leaves outside the skin, it's called the shaft. So 2 regions of the hair, shaft, and then going inside, root. What surrounds the hair are these little flowery glands called sebaceous glands. Sebaceous glands. So these pink structures here, and then they opened it up here. It goes around the hair. On this one, it's this purple structure here. This is secreting oily sensations that we call sebum. So I get that oily sensation on my hair, my skin. That's produced by sebaceous glands. And if you remember, there's 2 types of glands in the body, exocrine and endocrine. These are exocrine glands because they're secreting their product to a direct target, to the surface of the skin. Remember, these glands are specifically epithelial tissue. We call them glandular epithelium. In a previous video, we talked about their mode of secretion. How do exocrine glands secrete the product? This one goes through a process called holocrine secretion, where the cells burst and die, and the product is that oily sensation. So sebaceous glands. That was a lot to say just for the sebaceous glands. Eccrine or merocrine sweat glands. I see here, this structure here, and you see the tube disappear into the tissue. Same here. This is an eccrine or merocrine sweat gland. And then this eccrine sweat gland shows the tube going all the way up to the surface, because this is our normal perspiration or water perspiration, another type of exocrine gland. And this one goes through a process called exocytosis, another mode of secretion. On this side, this white structure with the tube coming up, and this white tube with the tube coming up is my eccrine sweat gland. Other structure to see is that muscle that runs with the hair. It's called an erector pili muscle. Erector, to make something erect, pili referring to a hair, and it's a muscle. So it literally is a muscle. So I ask my students, what type of tissue is this? There's only 3 types of muscle: cardiac, smooth, and skeletal. Cardiac, this is not my heart. Skeletal, this is not attached to a bone. So by process elimination, this is a smooth muscle. So it's an erector pili muscle is the name of the structure. The type of tissue is smooth muscle. It erects the hair. It's supposed to trap heat. This is what causes goosebumps. So when I erect the skin and I tighten it, I close the hairs together. In theory, I trap the heat to help me maintain the heat in my body. So it's a temperature regulation, but we see that when we're contracting the skin to generate some energy and some heat. But when we watch something amazing or a movie or a sport, you get those goosebumps. When you get scared a lot, all of a sudden you may get goosebumps as well. It's a defense mechanism to provide that heat. So erector pili muscle. So we talked about layers and structures and then some of our modes of secretion. Epidermal layers. We're learning the 4 to 5 layers that make up the epidermis. When we look at the skin model, we learn that there's the 2 layers of the skin, the most superficial layer, the epidermis, and then the middle layer, the dermis, and then we'll say, well, subcutaneous or below the skin is the hypodermis. That's not part of the skin, yet we teach it as part of the integumentary system. So I tend to go back and just say there's 3 layers: epidermis, dermis, and hypodermis. When we look at the epidermis and you slide over in this model, you can see that there's multiple colors going through here because it's trying to show you that there's multiple layers. There's 5 layers of the epidermis in the soles of my feet and the palms of my hands. So I have extra protection for that contact and sensation. Other parts of the body, it's 4 layers of the epidermis. So my skin on my arm is 4 layers, hands, 5. So we're learning those 5 layers. So if I take the epidermis and expand just on all of these here, the way I remember this is come, let's get sunburned. Come, let's get sunburned. So from superficial down is stratum corneum, stratum lucidum, stratum granulosum, stratum spinosum, and stratum basale, which is also called germinativum. I'm using the word stratum. Stratum is referring to layers. So these layers include these. As I describe them, I'm going to go from deep to superficial. So basale or germinativum is just that dark little line here at the base. These are the cells that are the most like embryonic stem cells. They will gradually become spinosum, granulosum, lucidum, and corneum. So they make it to the top. And so this takes roughly about a month, around 30 days, for basale to come up. Remember we said epithelial tissue is our deeper tissue. It's our 99 cent cells that I can keep producing over and over again. So basale is our young cells that are going through mitosis. And we'll talk about specialized cells that we see in here to protect them. They will turn into spinosum, and spinosum is referring to the appearance that the way the protein, the filaments look inside the cells, that it looks like spiny. So we call it spinosum. They are starting to go through a little bit of a dying off process. They're still dividing, but just not as much as basale. When we get to granulosum, again, they appear grainy, so the term granulosum just by structural appearance, but I see a change in color here. Granulosum, now the cells are starting to flat off and they're starting to die. What's happening is we're filling with a protein called keratin. That keratin's replacing the cytoplasm to give me some waterproofing and some strength. So what I'm trying to describe is this slowly what we call degeneration, or the cells are dying off. Once we get to lucidum, which means lucid or transparent or clear, the cells are now dead. So from lucidum up to corneum, these are all dead cells. Lucidum is what we call thick skin. Thin and thick. Thick is that one unique layer that's for my palms of my hands and soles of my feet. We only see those in hands and feet. So lucidum is referring to thick skin in those two areas. It's dead cells. And then corneum. Corneum is a thick layer. Spinosum is our thickest, but corneum can be about 25-30 layers. Remember we said this is stratified squamous epithelium. So all of this is stacked cells, but that corneum is our last layer of dead cells that give us that overall windshield protection of the body. So come, let's get sunburned. This is all the layers of the epidermis, the type of tissue, stratified squamous epithelium. In another video, we'll talk about the specialized cells that are within this layer. Histology of the skin. We did do histology of just the epidermis to learn the 5 layers, and we learned the come, let's get sunburned. Now we're going deeper, and I'm using a reference to show all the layers of the skin. But remember when we did stratified squamous epithelium, that's that dark purple ribbon that I expand when we covered epithelial tissue. The layer is the epidermis. So if I expand over here, from here up, all of this dark purple ribbon, and you can see it extends down here because it's still epithelial tissue. This is all the epidermis. Type of tissue, stratified squamous epithelium. When I go deeper and we get into the dermis, this is all now connective tissue. The hypodermis is also connective tissue. So let's expand to our right over here. When we looked at the model, we said just that first layer underneath or deep to the epidermis is my papillary layer of the dermis. So specifically, it's the papillary layer. What type of tissue is this? Areolar connective tissue. Areolar connective tissue. As I go deeper, the rest of the dermis is my reticular layer, and that type of tissue is dense, irregular connective tissue. So we have the epidermis, stratified squamous epithelium. The dermis is 2 layers, papillary layer and reticular layer. Type of tissue, areolar connective tissue, and then dense, irregular connective tissue. This is not shown in the hypodermis, but if we go into the hypodermis, remember the primary type of tissue is adipose tissue. We just did a video on adipose tissue to look at all those clear white bubbles. Other things I can see is the hair. Remember, we can divide it into different regions inside the skin. The hair is called the root. As it goes above the skin or outside, it's called the shaft. Wrapping around it are these little bubbly structures here, and it's been cut. A lot of times I'll tell my students it depends on the view because I can see a little bit of hair here. So it depends on how it's cut. Did I cut my arm like this or did I cut it like this? So you get a different reference on the side. But all of these structures, but around the hair, this is a sebaceous gland, These dark ones down here, where it almost looks like a cut spaghetti ball, here and here, those are my eccrine sweat glands for my watery perspiration. And then I can see a slight cut here. Here's some smooth muscle, and there's some smooth muscle. Typically, we'll see them riding against the hairs, and I can see them here. This is erector pili muscles. Remember, the type of tissue is a smooth muscle, but they tend to help with the hair, move the hair, and keep it erect. So erector pili, this is not a good representation here. They tend to slide along next to the hair, but I can see them here, erector pili muscles. So this is histology expanding into the dermis and hypodermis. Histology of the epidermis. When we look at our skin, we had 3 layers, epidermis and dermis. Hypodermis, not technically part of the skin, but we still teach it as part of the skin. And then we're looking at specifically the epidermis that has 4 to 5 layers, depending on what part of the body. Remember, it's thick and thin skin. Thick skin is 5 layers. We see that on palms of my hands and soles of the feet. 4 layers in other areas. And what's unique to thick skin is my lucidum. So as we go through these, we're focusing on the 5 layers and looking at lucidum. And if you remember, the mnemonic that I described with this is come, let's get sunburned. So corneum, lucidum, granulosum, spinosum, and basale, also known as germativum. This is, I remember, as come, let's get sunburned. So as we go superficial to deep, so the corneum is what I can actually make contact on the apical surface. And so the corneum is roughly about 20 to 25 layers, and it's dead skin. As I go deeper, this is where I hit this lighter portion. I just look for a change in appearance knowing my order. Some of your slides in your classes, this will be more of a pink or purple in some cases, but I just look for that change. So I use stratum lucidum for my hands and my feet for that extra protection as I grip, and it contributes to how I'm able to grasp things while I have that extra protection. Notice I keep using the word stratum or strata. That means layer. So stratum corneum, stratum lucidum. Stratum lucidum is also dead skin. So when I say dead skin, the cells are dead. When I get into granulosum, it's just this thin layer of cells here. So you can see like a darker purple strand here of cells, and granulosum is referring to the way the cells look if we go in a higher magnification. But now they're at a point to where there's some of them are alive, some are not. So it's going through various stages of what we call degeneration. When I look at spinosum, spinosum is based on the appearance again. It looks like it's spiny based on the cytoskeleton, the filaments in the cells. You can't see this, but that's the origin of the name. Spinosum is our largest layer. And so we do have mitosis here, not as much as basale, but I do have more mitosis, meaning the cells are dividing, which makes sense that it's deeper in nature. And then at the very end of the epithelial tissue, specifically, remember all this is stratified squamous epithelium. And it's based on number of layers, 2+ layers, stratified, squamous, meaning thin, flat, scale-like cells, and we bunch them all together. When we stratify things, it's typically for protection, which makes sense. This is the windshield of our body. So at the base, just this line here is stratum basale, and this is the end on the deepest part of our epidermis. Underneath it, this is all connective tissue. Specifically, this will get into the papillary layer of the dermis, and that's our underlying connective tissue. So this entire layer is the epidermis. What type of tissue is it? Stratified squamous epithelium. We'll cover another video where we talk about the specialized cells that we find within this, but let's start by introducing that. Remember I said stratum basale is our deepest layer where we have the most mitosis, meaning the cells are dividing. They will turn into spinosum, differentiate. They will turn into granulosum, then lucidum, and then corneum. And roughly this takes about a month, around 30 days, for basale to ultimately make its way up to the top, the superficial surface, to become corneum. So within spinosum, I have the most mitosis, which means it's dividing. These are more of our germ cells or stem cells that will gradually change. And where we have protection here is we're using certain cells called melanocytes to protect them from UV light because they're dividing. I'm not worried about seeing any melanocytes in the corneum because the cells are dead. You're not going to kill them again. So as I go through basale, I turn into spinosum. Less mitosis. As I get into granulosum, now it's going through stages of what we call degeneration. The cells are actually starting to flatten and die off, and we fill it with a protein called keratin. And that's for protection, but also to give me some waterproofing strength and to control permeability. So once we get past granulosum, now lucidum and corneum, all of these cells are dead. But there's still protective layers, right? If I threw a can of paint on you, it just doesn't go right in. I have time to wash it off, and based on the chemical nature of it, it allows me time to protect myself. We're mostly looking at controlling the salts and water that could leave our body, but we use this as a protective layer. So remember, come, let's get sunburn. These are our layers of the epidermis, type of tissue, stratified squamous epithelium. This is a review of epidermal cells, the cells that are in the dermis. We said the epidermis, the type of tissue, is stratified squamous epithelium. But we're getting into some of the specific functions of the cells that sit within this layer. Majority of the cells, roughly about 90%, are keratinocytes that make up that keratinized stratified squamous epithelium. So there's 4 types of cells that we're going to cover. Keratinocytes, we said, was the majority of the cells, which makes them the most abundant. What they produce is a protein called keratin. And keratin will fill the cytoplasm to give me some waterproofing and some strength as they come together. Remember, with some desmosomes, we talked about our cellular attachments. Desmosomes we see within the skin. So keratinocytes, the majority of the cells, provide that structural function of waterproofing and strength to give me that barrier and control permeability. So keratinocytes. Melanocytes, another structural cell that's helping to defend the ones that are going through mitosis. So melanocytes produce a protein called melanin, and this is where we get the skin tone of our skin, the color of our skin. If I go out into the sun, these melanocytes will help to absorb the UV radiation, because we learned when we talked about cancer that UV radiation can disrupt the DNA machinery, the DNA of the nucleus, and disrupt the homeostatic balance of the cells and could create cancer. So the melanocytes is a pigment, a protein pigment that absorbs it to make sure it doesn't cause any problems. When I go out in the sun too long, I exceed homeostasis and I can get a sunburn. Now, some people have larger melanocytes or more active melanocytes, which changes the skin color. So somebody that has darker skin than me has more active melanocytes. So melanocytes is a protective layer that we see in the deeper layers. So remember, we learned our layers, stratum basale or germinativum and stratum spinosum have these the most because we're protecting the cells that are dividing. When I get to the corneum, these are dead cells. I don't need melanocytes. They're not going to die again. They're already dead. So I see melanocytes at the deeper layers, primarily at stratum basale, our deepest layer of the epidermis. Langerhans cells is a protective layer. We see less of them, but they're called macrophages. A lot of our cells, when it comes to immunity, are going through a process called phagocytosis, which means the cells engulf and eat things that don't belong. So debris, pathogens like bacteria, viruses, parasites, they engulf them to protect us. So our immunity starts with our skin, and it's our first protective barrier. So they help to destroy things that don't belong when we're exposed to something at the surface of our skin. Merkel cells are named after a person that called them Merkel cells, and they are designed for light touch. So I have sensation. We put these cells together that are called Merkel discs, and these Merkel discs help for the sensation of feeling things. So if I was to put on a shirt with a button, or if I grasp something and feel the texture, these Merkel cells help with that. But it's a good way of understanding what I'm coming to contact with, because that's part of my survival and defense. So we see these cells that are specialized in the epidermis. Keratinocytes, the majority of them for protection. Melanocytes protect me from UV radiation from the sun. Langerhans for defense and immunity. And then Merkel cells for light touch.